This week, Meg Russell's book, The Contemporary House of Lords, Westminster Bicameralism Revived, was published by Oxford University Press. An event was held in the House of Lords to mark the book's launch. I asked Meg a few questions about the book. Well, I guess the first obvious question is, why do we need a book about the House of Lords?
Well, I think there are a couple of good reasons that you could give for that. One is it's a very little studied institution. There's not very much out there on it. People know much more about the Commons than they do about the Lords. And the other one is that it's much more important than it used to be. There was a reform in 1999 that removed most of the hereditary peers, and since then the Chamber has changed fundamentally, both in terms of its makeup and its behaviour. So it's well overdue revisiting, really.
What are the key arguments that you make in the book?
One of them, I would say, is relating to that point about change in 1999, that it's actually a much more modern institution than most people realise. It's changed an awful lot in terms of the kind of people who are in there, as well as what it does. And in terms of what it does, another key argument is that it's actually quite an important policy actor now. People assume that it's weak, but actually it's increasingly influential.
Okay, let me take the first of those first. You say that the Lords is more modern. To many people, the Lords still seems like quite an antiquated institution. In what sense would you say it's modern?
Well, the typical media image of the House of Lords is a picture of elderly white men wearing red robes trimmed with ermine. In fact, if you go into the House of Lords, you never see that, because they only wear those on one day of the year, which is for the Queen's speech. It's a misrepresentation of the House of Lords, really, but you can't read a media story without, Google the House of Lords, those are the pictures you're going to find. In fact, it's a much more normal parliamentary institution than that. It's full of ordinary men and women wearing ordinary clothes, going about their parliamentary business. It's also much more diverse than it used to be. The white male image isn't really right anymore. It's got the same proportion of women as the House of Commons, and it's actually got a higher proportion of ethnic minority members than the House of Commons. So many people, if they looked in there, would be quite surprised by what they saw.
Okay, and then moving to the second of those, its policy impact. In what way and to what extent does the House of Lords actually influence government policy?
Well, the most obvious thing is that the change in 1999 turned it into a no overall control chamber. No party has a majority in there. And the number of government defeats, the number of times the government is defeated in the House of Lords, has been very high. The Labour governments between 1999 and 2010 were defeated nearly 450 times, and the coalition has so far been defeated 75 times. So every time there's a government defeat, there has to be some sort of negotiation. Sometimes the government overturns the defeat, but very often it actually accepts the defeat, or at least meets the Lords halfway. So all of those defeats lead to quite a lot of policy change. But then also there's policy change which is much less visible than that. Partly because the government knows that it's susceptible to defeat. There's a lot of negotiating that goes on around the detail of legislation in the Lords, partly in order to try and avoid defeat, and partly because it's appreciated that a lot of members of the House of Lords have a lot of experience and so on, and their points get taken quite seriously.
So is that where the subtitle of the book, Westminster Bicameralism Revived, comes from?
Yes, indeed. Bicameralism is a bit of a technical academic term meaning a two-chamber parliament. Bicameralism in Britain has classically, in the late 20th century at least, been seen as pretty weak. That's a central element of what people call the Westminster model, that the executive is strong, Parliament is weak, and the second chamber effectively doesn't make much impact at all. The book suggests that that is all changing, that the House of Lords is now much more of a significant policy actor. The government is having to therefore negotiate with Parliament much more than it used to. And indeed, an important point is that the strengthening of the Lords hasn't weakened the Commons. In some ways, it's actually strengthened the Commons. It's made government more responsive to Parliament overall, including its own backbenchers in the Commons, because it's very difficult to overturn Lords' defeats if you don't have support on your own side. So there's quite a complex dynamic, strengthening Parliament against the executive overall. That's where the revived comes from.
in terms of that negotiation with members of the House of Lords, I think one of the very interesting findings that's presented in the book is that influence often lies in the House of Lords with groups that many people would find quite surprising.
That's quite right. There's an analysis of the voting on the defeats in the book, which shows that it was the Liberal Democrats under Labour to 1999 to 2010 who the great majority of the time made the critical difference between whether the government won or lost a vote. There would have been hardly any defeats at all if the Liberal Democrats had supported the Labour government. So they got a surprising degree of power in the House of Lords. Years ago, long before coalition, the Liberal Democrats really mattered in British politics through the Lords. Now, the Liberal Democrats are in government, and the key swing voters in the Lords are the large group of independent crossbenchers. But who knows who they are? They're a very little known group. The fact that these independent members have a key role in British politics is something not yet fully appreciated.
And you mentioned there that the crossbenchers are now particularly influential, but actually, unlike most other peers, the crossbenchers aren't affiliated to a party that anybody has voted for. So does this not just underline the argument that the House of Lords is illegitimate when it influences government policy?
Well, it's interesting what you say about people voting, because of course that was one of the key arguments used by the Liberal Democrats when they were in opposition, that the House of Commons was unrepresentative of the way people voted, and therefore they had a right in the Lords, which is basically more proportional than the Commons, to try and block things. It's true that nobody votes for the independents in the Lords, but in fact there's quite a lot of support for them outside Parliament. When you look at polling on the Lords, people quite like the fact there are independent members in there and that the party links are weaker. But the legitimacy question is a really key one, and I actually devote a whole chapter in the book to looking at the question of legitimacy. What does it mean? What do people think of the Lords? How is it presented in the media? And what I conclude is it's much more complex than you might assume. It's clearly not democratically legitimate, but legitimacy is sort of in the eyes of the beholder, and many people like some of the aspects of the Lords, like the independent members and the relatively proportionate party balance, for example.
And interestingly, you haven't so far mentioned House of Lords reform, which is what many people think about when they hear the House of Lords. Does your book touch on that as well?
Yes, well, it's quite conscious that I'm not starting with reform, because it emphatically is not a book about Lords reform. It's a book about the Lords, how it works, what it does. One of the problems is that people have thought that the Lords is constantly on the brink of reform, and therefore let's not bother to look at it because soon it will all be changed. But in fact, reform comes around very rarely. Most reform schemes fail. But yes, there is a chapter at the end of the book reviewing reform proposals since 1999 and also the prospects for reform in the future.
And so what do you think is likely to happen in terms of House of Lords reform in the future?
Well, I think large-scale reform remains very unlikely. It's been under debate for 150 years. The two main parties, Conservatives and Labour, are both fundamentally split on it. The Liberal Democrats badly want major reform, but it's going to be very hard for them to find a majority in the Commons, either teaming up with Labour or Conservatives for it. The prospects for smaller scale reform, as the Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee is currently looking at, are rather better, but nonetheless quite difficult. But I think all of this, frankly, and I'm here to plug my book, of course, is an argument for looking at the House of Lords as it is now and what it does now. Because if we sit around waiting for the next reform, we could be waiting for decades or another century. We need to understand the second chamber that we've got now. And it's actually surprisingly more effective, more diverse and more modern than many people think.